To Baltimore?
Baltimore, okay.
Not too far.
Happy New Year. Baltimore.
Well, before I begin, I want to thank everyone who is here today. I know it's been a really long day, so thank you for sticking it out. And I want to give a special thank you to a couple people, specifically my chair, Michael Abrams, who guided me through this whole design and research process, and as well as Carl Dupuy, who never failed to encourage us to work hard and be brilliant. And then I also want to thank all my friends and family who made this day possible, especially Liam, who helped make this beautiful model that you see before you. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to the thesis, Can Design Evoke Youth? Exploring Paradigms of Intergenerational Interactions. This thesis challenges the way that architecture addresses aging, and it presents unique opportunities to look at senior living in a new light, in presenting opportunities to instill different social constructs that are more inclusive across generations. And so to begin to talk through this thesis process, we'll start with the understanding of the origin of the question, and then move into an analysis of how we began, or how we came to the site in Baltimore, and then move on into the design strategies that ultimately drove this final design you see before you. So to start off, I have a question. When you think about aging, what comes to mind? What does aging look like? What does it feel like? No, just think about it. And then another question is, think about retirement. Now when you think about retirement, what images come to mind? What are the things that motivate you after retirement, after you've finished working on a day-to-day basis? What new life goals motivate you? So these are all questions that in the next 10 years, 1 in 5 people in this country will be faced with. Thanks to the baby boomer generation, we will be reaching a new high of senior population, people aged 65 or older. And so, I don't know about all of you, but I believe that a lot of times these two questions evoke different images in your minds. A lot of times the idea of retirement might become associated with the idea of vacation, relaxing, or spending time with friends and family and grandchildren. Whereas then when you think about the word aging, sometimes it's loaded with these negative connotations, such as accessibility issues, or wheelchairs, or memory loss, all of these things that start to trigger negative emotions. Now why is that? It's due to an inherent ageism that's prevalent in our society. In other words, this disconnect between younger and older generations. And this comes from a lack of understanding of what aging really means. From a young age, we learn that it's scary to get older. It's scary to become an older person. And then once we finally reach the point in which we are older, we're suddenly faced with all of these new life obstacles that we don't necessarily know how to tackle. And so then this drives a wedge between the younger and the older generations, and ultimately starts to separate and segregate and result in social isolation of the seniors. And the seniors, as they become more socially isolated, more physically isolated, they start to gain this sense of perceived loneliness. And perceived loneliness has incredible detrimental effects on your mental health and your cognition, and can increase your risks of developing dementia. And all of these things can result in this negative feedback loop. So as these seniors are encouraging these new life changes, these new circumstances, they might find themselves frustrated or irritated and start to feel that further disconnect from those younger members of society. And so how can we start to tackle this problem? How can we begin to rewrite the narrative of what aging really means? Well, let's start at the beginning. By introducing young children to the concept of aging, by integrating them into spaces with seniors, we can begin to retrain the way we think about aging and what it means to be an older senior. 83% of retirees agree that working during retirement allows them to stay more youthful, while 45% are particularly interested in working with children. And this is all because they gain this new sense of purpose, meaning, and a revitalization in youthfulness by this engagement in this interaction. On the other hand, children, of course, have much to gain by having this kind of mentor-mentee relationship with an older, trusted adult. They have the opportunity to gain valuable life lessons and learn new life skills from much more educated and experienced members. And so how can we begin to think about creating spaces that might foster these relationships? And where might this relationship and this type of community thrive best? Well, this leads us into the discussion of how to find a site. To start off, let's revisit those ideas of the obstacles that we face as we age. As we reach our senior years, we might realistically face new changes. Our bodies and our minds might be different, and thus we might not be able to get ourselves to move around as we once did. And so the opportunity of accessibility and proximity to nearby assets is crucial. And so this led us to an urban context, specifically Baltimore, which is in this state the city with the highest senior population. So looking at the city of Baltimore, we focused in on 3 types of categories. First, the environment, looking at proximity to parks and water sources. Then looking at accessibility, looking at proximity to public transit, both within the city and to beyond. And finally, to proximity to nearby assets, such as zones of interest, which might be downtown shopping areas. Public schools, elementary schools, to have that outreach to the local community children. And then healthcare opportunities as well. And all of this analysis led us to the neighborhood of Fells Point, just west of Patterson Park. And so this site lies on the intersection of Wolf Street and Baltimore Street, and it's on these axes are the intersection of where Patterson Park and the Johns Hopkins Hospital meet. And so there's 2 great assets that are within 10-minute walk of this site. Within this 10-minute radius, there also lies several elementary schools, 3 for elementary students and 1 for early education students, very young children, several churches, and a few metro stops as well. And so this starts to tackle some of those barriers that might have been prevalent in maybe a suburban environment. And so now thinking about this site, how can we optimize it to create the spaces that are engaging seniors and children on a daily basis? So this led us to some design strategies that were accumulated by studying precedents. We began with looking at senior living precedents. Naturally, if we want to design a building that is designated for senior living, we want to be sure to understand the positives and the negatives that exist in current models. And something that I came across in this study was the common theme of organization around a central courtyard. There's a common outdoor space that is used by the seniors and sometimes by the public as well. And this is often either directly next to or a little bit set back from where the seniors are living, allowing them to interact as they so choose. Moving forward, I also looked at communal housing, specifically student housing, both international and national examples. And this is because student housing has a similar goal of creating spaces for the students that allow them to have independence and secure spaces, while also maximizing opportunities for social integration and social interaction with each other. And then finally, I looked at examples of early education models, and this was to not only design spaces that are fun and engaging for the young children, but also to look at the way they too have an interaction with nature. They often have these outdoor spaces for children to get outside and play around and not feel boxed in. And so altogether, this drove several precedent principles, which began with the senior living and ended in that early education model. So these principles include designing spaces for spontaneous interactions, allowing children or seniors or both to find opportunities to passively and actively engage with each other. It also reinforced that idea of this threshold between the indoor and outdoor, having spaces, different types of spaces that remind them constantly of nature and the outdoors. And then giving them spaces not only for their own independent zones, but also allowing them numerous opportunities to engage with each other and the community around them. And finally, there are principles too that pertain to the particular senses, which include looking at the use of light and color, the use of haptic feedback, and once again, that connection to the outdoors, both for materiality and space design. And so now moving on to how to implement all of these design principles into a design, it's important to understand that the reality is there need to be sacred zones for seniors and for children in a space like this. Realistically, the seniors won't want to see children 24 hours a day. They just won't. So they'll need to have spaces that separate them on occasion when they so choose. But there also needs to be these moments, these intermediate zones where they can cross over as they so choose throughout the day, both passively and actively. And so this led to the form creation of the building. So starting with the site, just a little bit of background on the site. It is currently an unused field that has a drastic slope of 20 feet from the east edge to the west edge. And it also currently interrupts a popular street. So in order to fix that urban condition, we stitched together that street and brought it through again and allowed this site to be its own block as the remaining the context is. And then we placed bars on the north and south edges, taking inspiration from the context around in order to develop the elements of the facade, and also optimizing opportunities for daylighting through that south facade for the seniors. And so these bars are where the seniors would be living. And then down below, facing into that central courtyard, would become that first intermediate zone. It's a space that is below the senior living, but it encourages the children to come and be a part of it. The second intermediate zone is the link between the two on the ground plane. And this is on the east side. This is the Learning Center. The Learning Center is essentially a daycare center for children where they can come and learn and be cared for during the day while their parents may be at work. These are young children, generally between the ages of 2 and 6 or 7. And during the day, these children can engage in classes, and they can also have those classes even be taught by the seniors in this space. They can also spend time in their own sacred zone, or the seniors can spend time in their own sacred zone. And these two zones are elevated up above the building. And so you can see in some of the images on this board here, the sacred zones are hovering above the landscape, allowing them to look into that central courtyard and observe the activity that's happening down below, as well as looking beyond and looking out into the city, and allowing them that private personal space while they passively interact with the activity that's happening down below. And finally, the final step was to enclose this courtyard with a large canopy that allows the space to be used year-round and not be limited by the rain or the snow. And so to walk through this floor plan, you begin as a senior, you would enter into the welcome house. And this welcome house is on the westernmost side of the site, and it's on the lowest end of the slope. The courtyard itself has been mostly flagged out with several terraces that start to section off specific zones of use that can be flexible. And as a senior, you would enter into the welcome house, and then you would move right or left into your own residential wing. From there, you might choose to go upstairs into your own residential corridor, into your home, or you might decide to move further down that corridor into the courtyard using these intermediate zones, and entering into this first zone where it's spaces that are providing opportunities for music, for art, for creating, and for exercising. And so these are spaces that just children can also engage in. And at the far end of the site, on the east side, is the lowest level of the Learning Center with several classrooms that look into the courtyard. And it's important to note that on the west side, there are just a few opportunities in this building for people beyond these two primary age groups to use, including a grocery store and a salon that open up to the street. And then the other two spaces that have access from the besides that welcome house or the Learning Center entry, are these spaces on a mezzanine level. And they're from the side streets, the north and south streets. And these are spaces that are entered from the outside, and they're used by the employees who work in the building, as well as employees who work in a medical center down below here to serve immediate needs for the seniors who live there. And the point of this is to limit the access into the building to maximize the security of the people who live here, while not seeming too much like a castle to the buildings around it. And then if we move up to the first floor, on the east side, this is now the entry to the senior living. Oh, sorry, to the Learning Center, rather. In that first open space, you enter in the northmost portal, and it's this big atrium space that has a cafe on the ground floor, and it has the sacred zone of the children poking through above. You can move down that corridor into these flexible learning classrooms that open up into a big collaborative learning space. And then if you move further down the corridor, there's smaller classrooms that are designated for the particular care of the children, as well as offices for the people who are caring for them. And down at the furthest end of that corridor, it opens up into a big event space similar to the entry point. This one is a more flexible space that can be used for galleries, performances, etc. And this too, all of this in the orange, is proposed to be used also by the seniors as well as the children. And then if you look over into the west side of the building, this is where the senior living begins. All of their residences start here and move upwards. And this doesn't have direct access to the learning center at this level. Instead, you have to move through the communal spaces on the courtyard level. And this, again, pays attention to the way that security is throughout the building by minimizing those breach points. And finally, if you move to the third floor, this is where those sacred zones pop through. And in the seniors sacred zone, which is pictured here, you've got a double height space which is used for a general dining hall, but can also be transformed into a community room. There are resources off to the sides that allow to fuel those dining halls and those needs, as well as spaces in those volumes that pop out for social spaces and lounges. And in the children's sacred zone on the right-hand side is a library. And this is a sacred zone just for the children where they can read and learn and play, and then to observe the activity happening down below. And so before I wrap up, I want to walk through the experience of this building as both a senior and then a child. So as a senior resident, you might wake up in your apartment and walk out into the hallway, look out into the courtyard, and observe the activity that's happening down below. You also might turn to your neighbor and sit on your porch and have a conversation with them. You might then proceed down the hallway into the dining hall. And here you might have a communal breakfast with some of your friends, while some of your other friends might be spending the morning having breakfast in their own homes where they're provided their own kitchenettes. And then for that afternoon, they might decide to go downstairs into the intermediate zone, the first zone on the ground level. And here they might spend the day painting, they might spend the day making music or exercising. And in these kinds of spaces, they can start to interact with children. These rooms have been designated as spaces that can also be used by the children in a safe and friendly environment. And then they might move their way down through the courtyard, down this pergola, from one wing to the next. And through this pergola here, they might be walking through from the music room to the exercise space, or from the swimming pool and going over into the art space. And then from that movement, they might decide to move into the learning center. And then as they move through the learning center, they might pop up into the entry corridor. And so in this entry atrium, this is where the cafe is on that ground floor. And so in that, they might sit there and enjoy a cup of tea while reading a magazine and observing the children that are entering the daycare for the day and running around. They also then might proceed down the hallway and see more children running around in the collaborative learning environment and running in and out of the classrooms. They might also enter one of those classrooms and use this as an opportunity to teach a life skill, such as art or music, to one of these children in these flexible classrooms. And then finally, they might spend the rest of the afternoon in the art gallery at the final culmination of that hallway. And up above, you can see there are children walking around a catwalk above. And at this point, I'll transition to the perspective of a child. So this child has just walked out of his sacred zone into this catwalk, looking into that atrium. And down below, he might see a performance going on, he might see people observing the art, and he may decide that he wants to go down there, or perhaps he's a little bit shy, and he decides to step back into that sacred link. And so here you can see there's small openings for them to observe more passively without being as engaged as he might be being in that actual space. And then finally, he may step into the sacred zone and go into the children's library. And here he might spend some time with his friends reading a book, or sitting on the stairs, or sliding down the slide and joining his friends at the bottom. He might then step down into the ground level, or take the elevator or take the stairs down to the ground level into these classrooms that are either private, specific for the children, or these flexible classrooms where they can again engage with those seniors in a learning environment. Architecture can be the vehicle through which seniors and children and different generations can become more integrated. And through successful design of senior living, we can begin to transcend the standard of a senior's lifestyle. And with that, I would like to open it up to questions.
How big is that courtyard? What are the dimensions of it?
So the courtyard is about, it's almost a square, so it's about 160 by 160.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about the development of the facade as you walk down the street here? I think you showed it in that elevation down there.
Yes.
what's the actual pedestrian experience as you're walking along this building?
So yeah, so that's also in this image here. So as you're walking down this street, sorry, I just want to remind myself, this is Wolf Street. And so this street leads up to Johns Hopkins Hospital. And so as you walk down this corridor, you see the bridge between the two, and you're actually able to look inside the courtyard between the two residential wings. So that's beneath here. But there's...
So is it open then?
So there's actually, let me see if I can find a good image of it. So there's a pergola, similar to the pergola that's happening in the middle of the courtyard, in this big image here. There's one at the entry point as well. And so there's a welcome house in the center that you enter through, and then you walk through the pergola to your residential wings.
So as I look at this elevation, then what am I seeing?
This is the opposite side of the building, actually. So this is the learning center. Yeah. So that the one you're thinking of is this one here. So here you see the welcome house with the pergola, and there's a lot of landscaping and small walls that prevent you from just walking through to the courtyard. So you have to first enter into that welcome house before proceeding into the courtyard.
So it's secured courtyard?
Yes, it is.
I have one quick question. How do you get from, if I'm a child and if I'm in this area down here, I'm in the learning center.
Yes.
And then I want to go up and be in the sacred space. What path do I take to do that?
Certainly. So it might be hard to bring the image up on the screen as well. So this is the entry hall. So when you walk into the learning center, that's this space here. You walk into this volume, and when you walk inside, that's what you see.
Where is that on the plan?
I'm sorry. Over here.
Okay, so that's like a triple height space.
It's a triple height space.
So that gets you from the learning center all the way up
to the sacred zone.
Where
exactly.
You're sort of bypassing, and so then on this side, is that also a triple height space at the bottom?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So those are those two sort of giant spaces that connect you across to the, and what was the thinking that made that space become elevated a full, obviously you're building a roof and then you're building an underside, so what is the thinking behind having the gap between in section?
I wanted to,
elevation.
Yeah, I wanted to enhance the sense of separation in certain private spaces. So since this whole building is really integrated amongst itself, it creates a lot of spaces where the seniors and the children can overlap. I wanted to make it both visually clear and physically clear that there's this difference in the zone back down below as well as the zone and the zone up above. So I felt that pulling them apart like that might create that sense of passing through a different threshold to get into a new type of space. So if they were on the same level, I felt it might be more accessible for anybody to enter into that space, and I wanted it to feel like some sort of sequence you have to get through in order to get to that space. And that's a sequence only the children really should be experiencing.
Do the children ever use the courtyard?
Yes, yeah.
So where do they access?
So the courtyard is accessible on the ground level here, but their own little play space is immediately accessible. Yes, that's actually accessible from the mezzanine level. So you have to walk down a level from this entry point to get into the first courtyard. I wanted to keep the courtyard primarily off of the same level as where the residents live.
So that's the section right there?
Yes, it is. So you would walk in through this entry level and then walk down this big stairs, which you can see in this image here. And then that opens up into the courtyard.
Did you ever look at that being sort of 3 levels all together as one piece, and not having the gap in between?
This right here. I did. Originally, I had some different forms. Actually, so I have a lot of study models, but so some of my forms, started with just having almost like a C-shaped building, and then I had some sloping aspects to it. Ultimately, I decided so something that I had explored for a while was this idea of the roof plane being accessible, but my fear with this was that people coming off the street would start to wander onto the building and into the building, and it might breach the security of the building itself. And so I explored this for a long time, but ultimately I decided that I wanted to keep that sacred zone sacred. I really wanted to emphasize how important that type of space for the children was, and so that's where the elevation came up.
So when did this roof come about, the courtyard?
The canopy?
When did the courtyard roof come?
that's something that I tackled for weeks and weeks with, between my chair and Carl Dupuy. We talked about it a lot. It was something we kept going back and forth on. A few weeks ago, I decided ultimately I think it's best to use the canopy as a means to prevent limiting that courtyard to like only part of the year. I didn't want necessarily the courtyard only be used from April to September. I wanted it something that you can also run around, because children are less likely to be really deterred by colder weather, but they are probably deterred by rain and snow, a little bit. They're children, but a little bit. So I wanted to provide optimal opportunities for them to be using it year-round.
I just want to criticize your description of the seniors. Seniors today, it's not what you described. They exercise, they are creative. I have a friend that passed away not long ago. She was Kathleen Williams. She was 104, and she would come to my house for lunch when she was 102. And she was creative till the last years, and always looked perfect. You couldn't tell she's 100. Anyway, but what I recommend that you read Jim Cohen. He's a psychiatrist in Washington, D.C. He's not alive anymore, but I think he passed away maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And he has a couple of books about age and creativity. And he shows that the most creativity comes to a lot of people in an older age, like Picasso. And Frank Gehry is now 90, and he's very creative. And so, like the Smith Act was invented by a woman in her 90s. So read the book, and then you will change completely your attitude. So if you started with this, that aging people, it's not people that just like in an assisted living or nursing home or retirement home, and they need, you would think differently about the people there. So,
did you interview any seniors?
Yes, and actually, do you mind if I respond to that? So I completely agree with you. I don't mean to spin it as though seniors don't do any of those things. In fact, I want to bring it to attention that they do. I want it to be known that spaces that are designed for seniors, the issue I have isn't with the people, it's with the spaces that are designed for them. And I don't think that the spaces, if you look at a lot of senior living precedents, I don't think they foster spaces for that creativity. So for instance, my own grandmother lives in a senior living home, and it's in a suburban neighborhood. And it's not quite the kind of environment that you would think about like wanting to live in, I think. She actually is thinking about moving somewhere else because she doesn't like it. And so I was using this description as a means to design a space for people and allow to foster that creativity and encourage them to stay active and create spaces that cater to those activities, because I think it's important that we don't think of senior living as a building that is missing all of those things. When we design residential apartment buildings, we often include all of these facilities, but a lot of times the senior living buildings, in my experience, are missing out on a lot of these things. And they're trying to cater to a type of person that's not really who they're thinking. They're thinking that seniors aren't as active as they are, or aren't as creative, or aren't as engaged as they are. And so that's something that I really wanted to focus on in this thesis.
So have you looked at the history, though, of senior living?
Yes,
Senior living is a typology. When did that start?
Oh, when it started? I actually
Yeah.
don't know that, yes.
There are seniors who live in row houses a block away from this site who are very active and who don't necessarily need a senior living building.
Right.
And so part of me struggles with even the typology of building. Not to say that some don't need maybe a more focused central space or central community, but it seems like if you have density and you can allow for the infrastructure of the needs, of the programmatic needs in a typical block, I don't necessarily think you need a senior living super block. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a challenge that I faced early on, is the pushback between the people who actually want to live in senior living. Especially, I know, there's this especially in the, I don't know, in the interviews that I've had, I would say, there's people who enjoy senior living and like to live with others, but there's also a lot of people who still feel the need to live in their own home.
Is there a continuum of care here, or is it just independent living?
This is independent living.
So there's no nursing care or no memory?
No, there's a medical center on site, right, but
There's
there's
no
not,
assisted living.
no,
This is largely independent.
yes.
Maybe I missed, why are you calling it sacred?
Sacred it's actually a term I read in my research, but it's a term that I'm using to describe the spaces that are sacred to the particular user. So sacred to the senior is specific to that particular user. So the sacred zones are more reserved for the seniors and ones. It's private, yes.
But just, when you use that word and people are at an older age, I don't know, maybe I'm just bringing religion into it, that's coming from Catholic University.
Yeah, okay.
Sacred with a small s.
Okay, yes.
I mean, especially in this case, it's totally open, and there's nothing really private about it.
It's the access that's private. It's not necessarily supposed to be completely enclosed. That's more of the living units themselves, right?
Okay, so I think that we can probably all say that this is a very impressive project. It really is. I mean, the basic scheme, I think, is very, very strong. So we'll start with that so that we can get to the things that don't really work.
Okay.
And the first thing, the reason why I asked you about the size of the courtyard and then about this roof is I think that that's the weakest part of the project. I don't buy it at all. That it's there.
The roof?
I don't think you should have it.
The roof?
Yeah, I think, because I think if you, what's interesting to me, look right behind you, point out the 4 columns of that roof in that courtyard.
Yeah.
Those things would be like 10 feet in diameter in real life. When you would, I think that if you really designed them structurally, you would find that thing is so big that you wouldn't want to do it. And it would be so expensive that nobody would ever pay for it anyway. Because I think the courtyard's actually very interesting without it.
Okay.
And I think, if you want cover, you already have cover. You've got a pergola that you could have a roof on in some places. There are other ways to do what you want. Because what you're running the risk of is making that really more like an atrium than a courtyard. And I think those two things are very, very different. But I think that your basic scheme with the 2 bars is very good. The bridges that I really like the way they pierce the building. I think is strong. I think your urban design strategy is very interesting. I agree with the comment about I think those bridges, you're a little bit trapped in the equivalence between them. The one side doesn't really need to be anything like the other. So that gap that we were talking about a little earlier, I think is sort of pointless. I don't know what that really does for you. But I will say, I mean, I think this is a really strong scheme. I mean, and I also want to comment at the level of, elevations. I mean, I think you've really designed a lot of this, and it's, handsome, if I can use that word. One other little thing, back to the bridges, and Matt's walking out the door. This little welcome building you have there, get rid of that.
They're going into jail.
Yeah, it's not welcome, it's keep out.
Yeah.
This little thing under the bridge.
This is what welcome house, yeah.
Yeah, was that, and that doesn't appear in your model, was that something that came kind of later as a security measure, or?
Actually, yes, it did come later. It did come after this model, but yes, it did come later. It's something that I struggled with, I'll be honest, it's something that I struggled with a lot. I wanted to introduce a level of security at that entry point so that not just anyone can walk into this courtyard, because realistically, I wanted this courtyard to be primarily reserved for the seniors and the children. So without something there, it felt too open and too inviting and a little bit at risk of invaders. And so I wanted to have some kind of welcoming situation happen. That's something that I've been exploring for a while.
Yeah, that might have suggested that maybe you actually put some program
Okay.
on there on the first floor. It could still be kind of a glassy
Okay.
piece. I wanted to speak a little bit about the intergenerational concept. I think it's a very powerful thesis and a beautiful building and very thoroughly documented. You've pretty much thought about every room in this entire project. But it sort of feels like a bit of a reaction against what we are seeing pop up all over around the country, these senior living communities, and it sounded like you've maybe spent some time there. So you're building kind of a very urban building. It could be multifamily or, given where it is, but you're bringing together two specific age groups. And so I wonder if you thought about the concept of intergenerational bringing teens to the building. It's like this is very much like it feels like a children's daycare center and I don't want to say senior, and a housing community brought together, but it seems like there's an opportunity there. I mean, the whole intergenerational thing is really powerful because in other cultures, people get older and they still are around their families or they're around, people of all age groups.
I think that might have been the root of Matt's comment. Go ahead.
No, I mean, in this country, and it is a very lonely experience. I'm watching my parents go through that. They live in one of these communities that has all levels of care. So, but there's there's a building that has dining and, some communal spaces in it. But other than that, they still have to drive everywhere. There's not even sidewalks. It makes me crazy. And the fact that you thought about the fact that people who live here use the surrounding community, they don't have to drive anywhere. I mean, that becomes a huge thing for people when they age, and not being able to drive and giving up that freedom can just, be a downward turn towards depression and that sort of thing. So I think the urban idea of a concept of senior living, I wish I could think of a better word for it, but just intergenerational housing with a community center aspect of it is a powerful idea. But it's a beautiful, beautiful building and beautiful presentation.
It's a nice project, Emma, and very well presented. And there's a lot of sort of interesting things going on in senior living today about exactly this sort of thing. Where these people should be, even the services that are provided, whether they need them anymore, whether what's going to draw the current generation of aging baby boomers and others. Because the senior living world is in a bit of a crisis because the people who used to populate these things aren't going to these kind of things anymore because they don't want to retire and stay in their houses longer and things. So there are some changes happening. It strikes me though, and I agree with the comments about the roof, it looks like somebody else landed it there, particularly in the section there, the cheese board. It's sort of quality of it. It's much better as a space.
Okay.
But the thing that I think is kind of interesting about the project is we're kind of critiquing it as though these two program elements are coming together, and there's a lot of ways that buildings like this can be made to work. I think if you looked at traditional cities like Rome or Paris and you studied city blocks and things, you would find things like this that happen in those blocks, where you have part of the blocks in elementary school, part of it's residential, part of it's retail, and they find a way to kind of resolve themselves in the city and stuff. And so today we're thinking it's a radical concept to put this independent living folks next to it. It isn't. It is actually, probably much more common in traditional cities like those places I mentioned than you would find. I think if that were the case, where I was looking at it from that point of view, I'd probably do a couple of things a little bit differently. In the ground floor plan, I would have fewer of the kind of service things on the outside wall, maybe. I might try and pack that stuff differently so there was I don't know if that's into the area.
Yeah, so I agree, it feels a little bit strange, but the reason this is happening here is actually because if you look at the elevation, it's starting to happen underground over here.
Yeah.
So they start to become tucked underground and they wouldn't have access to sunlight anyway.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. I mean, I think that I would be super mindful of how the building relates to the street. And then when a sloping condition like that, you obviously have to pick your battles. You know, you've probably chosen well. The entry thing with the little gatehouse there, I think is sending the wrong sign to the community. There, because it's basically, it looks like a little police hut, you know, and one of the things that they say about safe communities is that you don't want to have a hut for the police because it basically says unsafe, you know, so you would want to probably minimize that as a kind of thing.
Matt, when you stepped out, the police hut was already cut.
Okay, it's got its own, okay. So, well, the other possibility would be, do you actually enter the courtyard and have other zones in the courtyard that are more private as you go deeper into it? Instead of it being all private, you could actually go into it and there are layers of gates or level changes and things that allow for the level of privacy that you want. Use the section, the slope to do that. That would help.
The slope is perfect for you to do that.
But, you know, it is incredibly impressive, and it is very nice to sort of speculate on this kind of a thing in the city that, you know, of two groups we want in the city. We want our older folks who are aging, you know, that have a place and they're welcome. And we want to be able to have functional schools and nice facilities for the kids as well. And I think the courtyard, the only complaint I would have a little bit about it is that I think the sacred space for the seniors there seems a little bit overwrought to me, this kind of glass bridge and all the sun that's going to be coming in there. What's that? Yeah, you're going to cook them a little bit, but it makes me wonder whether maybe just having a kind of nice space out in the courtyard or some level there would actually suffice for some of those things. It's the one thing to me that I sort of is drawing attention, I think, in a way that automatically makes me wonder whether you really need it to solve the problems of giving these folks nice public spaces or communal spaces within the building.
I just wanted to pile on the congrats as well. I think your presentation is really easy to understand. The graphics are nice, and you've done a lot of thought. The one area I wish you would explore a little bit more as I look at this, and I think it would have helped with some of the comments that you've been getting about the programming, is you've only provided two different unit layouts, a one-bedroom and a two-bedroom. And at first, when we first started this conversation, I thought, I assumed that both families and elderly populations could live here. And then I was like, oh, maybe not, and then it may be. Like, it was a little unclear. And I think the reality is, for this to be the kind of dynamic, I think you really want an intergenerational community. And for that to be the case, I think instead of like two typologies, you probably have like five. To like really span the gamut. I think that five kind of probably would have informed a few other moves you might have made around the building. Aside from that, I think that the overall moves were quite well and very nice.
Thank you. Could I address?
So I just want to piggyback on that real fast. As you were presenting, I was thinking, I live in an intergenerational community. So the building I live in is a building that I hope to die in. I know for certain if I ever left Maryland and went someplace else, I'd never sell the apartment. So along Connecticut Avenue, there are a lot of those grand apartment buildings.
North.
And they have everything from newlyweds and single nesters to very senior people. And they also have the walking environment that is so absolutely essential. I mean, my mother moved into the building 10 years ago, never lived by herself, had never lived in the city before, and she's totally independent of, to a flaw, actually. And it's partly because of the neighborhoods. They're looking at some of the buildings from Best Addresses in DC, the Kennedy Warren, where we've known people to age in place in that building. My building, the Broadmoor, up and down Connecticut Avenue, there are buildings like that, and that they also traditionally had other programs. Like the Kennedy Warren has a ballroom in it, and it had a restaurant in it. It has a little store where you can we can buy vino
That's a
late
movie
at
night.
night, and it has a place to pick up your dry clean. So there are all kinds of things in there that are part of this kind of hybrid program that exists in real buildings. And I agree. I think you'd want 5 or 6 different typologies.
They're called NORCs, naturally occurring retirement communities.
Do you mind if I just make a quick comment? So I wanted to point out that I actually do have a couple of different unit types. These are the 2 most prevalent ones, but I do have corner conditions as well that have 3 or 4 bedrooms in them, and those could be potentially opportunities for more families or more family members to come join. The layout was kind of encouraging multiple styles of independent living, but I don't actually know if the corner conditions aren't on this board. They're in the presentation, but I agree. I think that's an excellent point. Thank you.
What material is the facade?
This one?
Yeah.
It's a gray brick. It's a brick.
It's huge. So is it-
Yes, I think in these images it's
the scale-
enhanced. Yeah.
Can you talk about how the facades relate, if at all, to any of the contextual buildings? I don't think you really touched on that.
Right, yes. So for starters, I wanted to bring in the vertical rhythm that happens along the facade. So this push and pull, along the facade there's kind of a push and pull where balconies happen or where the bedrooms project forward. And so that vertical orientation was taken from the neighboring townhomes. Also, the actual design, particularly this facade, it was heavily inspired by Union Wharf down in Fells Point. So they have a very similar presence where there's a brick facade that's proud of another brick facade, and then there's a glazing element behind that separates the 2. And so I took that into consideration when I was designing this as well, since it's actually on the direct axis of Union Wharf. And really the biggest change was the gray brick. Because in that one it's red and smaller.
I want to talk about the sort of collage technique of your perspectives, because I think that it's one of the first times today that we've seen this technique used, and it's done really successfully here. And so we haven't in every presentation really talked about the graphics, but this method is you're really playing to your strengths here, and I encourage you to continue to use that and bring that to whatever offices you join. One thing in using that technique that can get a little tricky, there are things like the steel beams up here, the steel beams and columns that then sort of have this wood slicing through them, which is, I think, is suspect. So there's a couple elements like that you might want to just sort of revisit as you touch up and put things into your portfolio. But that technique, I think other students that are sort of thinking about how to present their thesis, this is successfully done in a way that allows you to push and give us the feelings, but you don't have to really represent every single corner. And when you're taking on as much as you did, that's kind of it's imperative. So my only critique of this again goes back to this element right here, and I think part of it is even thinking about the scale of a child, and this bridge piece is massive. I mean, you can see it in this image up there, and so it doesn't feel like it maybe even needs all of that. You've got this very fun character happening on the ground floor here, which is in this image down here is very, very tiny, almost minuscule, and then it's just overpowered by this bridge piece. And so I think if you look at, if you spend any more time kind of looking at this, that's one aspect that I would encourage you to just revisit.
Every kid I know would be under that stair.
Yes.
They look for cave-like small places.
And they want to go hide it. Anything they can climb on, but they're going to look to get under something, so I'll echo that. Just comment on that.
Certainly the seniors are not going to do that.
Maybe Brian.
What is that sort of tunnel on the east bank? Yeah.
So I wanted to provide parking below the building, and so I explored different, I didn't want to have the parking intervening with the building. So as a solution, I talked with some of my professors, we talked about maybe moving the entrance to the street level. And so it's something that's, the entrance is through the street, which I think is seen multiple times in Philadelphia as some precedents. But
Actually, your courtyard's big enough that you could have just had a double-level courtyard. The parking could have been under one of the levels of the courtyard.
the parking, yeah, the entrance to the parking is what I struggled with the most. The parking is located under there, but yeah.
You have this slope.
You have the slope, so
It's a
you,
built-in.
Right.
you
Yeah.
stick the parking in the slope.
Mm-hmm.
And that would get rid of a lot of problems you have, this entry problem, you know, just by changing a section of the courtyard.
So you were told to go into public space and
It was something that I explored for a while, and I didn't want it to take away from the integrity of the building, so that was a solution.
no, that's what we always have to do. That's the challenge.
Yeah, it
And
was
that's what makes it, urban project.
Right, yeah.
That's, yeah.
And if you've
Public
ever,
realm
if
stuff
you've ever
that you
been-
can't control.
if you've ever been to Toronto, where they were very licentious about this topic, they created some of the worst streets in the world. With as you try to walk down the sidewalk, you're constantly dodging cars that are doing insane things. I hate Toronto. Don't go there. Go to Montreal. Go to Quebec. Forget Toronto.
Emma, can you explain your elevation to East Ball? What's going on there? What is that gray?
Here.
No, on the bottom, the gray zone, the translucent.
That's just a translucent, so I made that translucent to show what's happening behind it, but that's the slope of the site moving along the site.
So those windows are actually
And then-
not like that, or they're going underground?
So there's actually, it's something you can see here, there's a slot where you can walk down the stairs and it opens up about here.
Oh, so
It
there's a
levels
gap
out, but
between the
there's a gap.
sidewalk.
And that lines up with the colonnade of the facade. So these are proud of the glass behind them so that you can actually walk between them. That is through here and through here. Oh, I'm sorry, not here because this is
Well, that's that elevation.
below. This is technically below ground on the mezzanine level, I think it should be correct.
Something that would
But it would
help
be
on your
there.
elevations would be stronger shadows.
Okay, yeah.
Just for punch, because they are gray. Because in theory, then all of those should be in shadow, right?
Yeah, oh, I see what you're saying, yes, yeah, they would be shaded. Mhm.
Emma, this is a very skillful project. Congratulations. I'm looking at your the level 3 plan and the section perspective through the courtyard. And I'm wondering if you had explored putting the thicker double-loaded piece on the north side and the single-loaded and maybe a lower piece out on the south side to get more light into that courtyard. Did you look at the
Oh, I see.
massing strategy?
So I did explore, I originally actually had both as single-loaded, and then arose the question of density on the site. And then so we took this as an opportunity to give those two types of experiences. I wanted the single-loaded corridor on this side to allow the residents to move down the hallway and have that frequent connection to the courtyard below. And then they have windows that face into that courtyard, corridor that are set back from the pathway, but allow the sunlight to come through still into that space from the south side. It's a little, but it's an interesting exploration to change them around. I've gone through a couple of iterations of where the corridors are.
Emma, as your chair, have the last words, which I'm very proud to say. I'm very happy for your work, and I'm very proud actually of the work you accomplished throughout this whole year. Emma started with this kind of thinking about her own grandmother, so it was very personal to her. And I know she was the topic of conversations week after week, and I think she would enjoy this place a lot. To say, same as my mother, who just became a widow last year, and she will be the first resident right here. She's very active, but hates driving, so I think it's a perfect spot for her. I have to say the graphics are quite lovely, beautiful. I think you have a very keen sense of showing exactly how to capture the quality of the space. and they're quite dramatic, quite lively. I think you tackle on something that we don't talk a lot in architecture, which is isolation. And it does happen a lot, especially in a lot of these senior homes, which, I work with developers in Chicago, a lot of senior homes, and they want to do as little as possible, because they just want to get their money done and rent a room, and that's it. And I think you're creating a platform and a place where they can integrate with society and communicate and socialize. Not only with the kids or generation, but within people of the same generation. So you provide a platform in which they can create and work and think and live together. And that'll give you a few more years, down the road. And I think it's quite lovely and very noble proposal. Since the beginning, I really like your thesis. I mean, you got me hooked from day one in the thesis match, because I think it was very interesting. Tackling senior citizens, places to live, they become kind of cookie cutters. I did a few of them in Chicago, and I did them, got paid. Am I proud of them? Probably no, not really. Some of them I'd rather not talk about, but this is something I'm very proud and happy for you. I think it's quite astonishing and very beautiful.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
I would ask the review